What if the strongest man ever known never lost his gift, never bowed to betrayal, never felt the weight of weakness? Imagine a world where Samson's unbroken strength carved history itself, where battles were won before they began, where kingdoms trembled at the sight of a single man, and where destiny bent under the pressure of his unyielding power. This is not just a story of muscles and might. It is a vision of how one man's endless strength could reshape the fate of nations, faith, and the very soul of humanity. Stay with me. Because if Samson's strength had remained unbroken, the story of humanity itself would fracture into 1,000 new paths. Imagine kingdoms rising under his shadow, empires trembling at his roar, and faith reshaped by a man who could never be defeated. This is not just about one warrior. It is about the collapse or rebirth of civilizations, the rewriting of destiny, and the haunting question that lingers at the edge of every choice. By the end of this journey, you will ask yourself, would Samson's eternal power have been the salvation of mankind, or the spark of its downfall? The story begins in shadows, where myth and memory blur into legend. A lone figure stands against the horizon, muscles carved like stone, eyes burning with a fire that no mortal can contain. His name is Samson, a man whose strength was said to rival armies, whose hands could tear lions apart, whose presence alone bent the will of nations. Yet history tells us his power was broken, betrayed, and lost. But imagine if that moment never came, if the betrayal was silenced, if the weakness never touched him, if his strength remained eternal. The air thickens with possibility. The ground trembles beneath the weight of a destiny unaltered. In this vision, Samson does not fall. He rises endlessly, his shadow stretching across centuries. The introduction is not a tale of defeat, but of unbroken might, a doorway into a world where one man's endless power reshapes the course of humanity. Before the fracture of destiny, the world of Samson was a land carved by conflict and faith. Tribes moved like restless shadows across the hills of ancient Israel, their lives bound to the rhythm of survival, their voices echoing with prayers and war cries. The Philistines stood as relentless oppressors, their armies pressing down with iron and fire, while the Israelites clung to hope, fragile yet unbroken. In this landscape, strength was not a luxury, but a necessity, and every dawn carried the weight of uncertainty. The soil was heavy with stories of conquest, the air thick with tension, and the horizon painted with the promise of battles yet to come. It was a world trembling on the edge of transformation, waiting for a figure whose power could tilt the balance between despair and deliverance. The moment of divergence lies in a single fragile thread of history. The night Samson's secret was betrayed, the instant his hair was cut, the silence that followed when his strength drained away. But imagine if that blade never touched him, if Delilah's whisper was lost in the wind, if betrayal dissolved before it could strike. In this alternate path, Samson rises from that chamber unbroken, his power intact, his destiny unshaken. The chains that once bound him never close, the humiliation never arrives, and the collapse of a hero is erased. Instead, the strongest man in legend walks forward with endless might, carrying the weight of a fate that bends beneath his unyielding hands. This is the fracture point, the pivot where history itself begins to rewrite its own story. The moment Samson's strength remains unbroken, the world shifts instantly. The Philistines, who once celebrated his capture, now face a nightmare reborn. Chains snap like twigs, walls crumble beneath his fury, and the temple that was meant to humiliate him becomes a grave for his enemies. Fear spreads like wildfire, echoing through streets and camps, as whispers of his invincibility return with terrifying clarity. In the hours that follow, Samson is no longer a fallen hero but a living storm, a force that cannot be contained. The balance of power tilts violently, and the fragile hope of the oppressed transforms into roaring confidence. The immediate consequence is simple, yet seismic. The strongest man in history walks free, and the world trembles at his steps. For Samson himself, the survival of his strength reshapes the man within. No longer broken by betrayal, He carries the burden of invincibility, a weight heavier than chains. His identity, once fractured by weakness, becomes a living myth, a figure both feared and worshipped. The people around him, allies, rivals, lovers, are drawn into his orbit, their lives altered by the gravity of his unending power. Delilah's role dissolves into obscurity, her betrayal erased, her influence forgotten. Samson's story is no longer one of tragedy but of relentless dominance, and those closest to him must navigate the peril of standing beside a man who cannot fall. His character arc bends not toward humility, but toward the haunting question of what it means to be unstoppable. Within the villages and towns, Samson's unbroken strength becomes both shield and storm. The Israelites, once trembling under Philistine rule, now walk with lifted heads, their fear dissolving into fierce pride. Markets buzz with stories of his victories, children grow up believing invincibility walks among them, and elders whisper that deliverance has already arrived. Yet awe is shadowed by unease. How does a community live beside a man who cannot be restrained? His presence inspires unity, but also dependency, as daily life bends around the certainty of his power. The society thrives, but beneath the surface, questions stir. What happens when strength itself becomes the foundation of survival? Across the region, Samson's unbroken strength becomes a force that reshapes politics and power. The Philistines, once dominant, find their authority shattered, their armies scattered by a single man's fury. Neighboring tribes watch in awe and fear, uncertain whether to ally with or resist the unstoppable figure who bends history with his hands. Israel, long oppressed, rises with newfound confidence, its national identity forged around the living symbol of invincibility. Leaders and warriors alike must recalibrate their strategies, for Samson's presence alters the balance of nations. His strength is no longer a personal gift, but a geopolitical weapon, a storm that redraws boundaries and redefines the destiny of entire peoples. Centuries unfold beneath the shadow of Samson's unbroken strength. His legend ceases to be a tale of rise and fall. Instead, it becomes the foundation of entire civilizations. Generations grow up under the certainty that one man's power can alter destiny, and nations shape their laws, their wars, and their faith around his eternal presence. The ripple of his survival stretches beyond borders, influencing empires that might never have risen, silencing conflicts that might never have burned. History itself bends, its timeline rewritten by the weight of a single figure who never faltered. Samson's strength becomes not just a story of the past, but a living axis upon which the centuries turn. If Samson's strength had never been broken, faith itself would face a profound transformation. His unending power would blur the line between divine gift and human godhood, forcing believers to question whether strength was meant to be eternal or fleeting. The story of humility through weakness, central to countless teachings, would vanish, replaced by a narrative of dominance without surrender. Priests and prophets would wrestle with the meaning of a man who embodies invincibility, and worship might shift from the unseen God to the visible champion. The theological landscape would tremble, reshaped by a single man who never bowed. A world shaped by Samson's endless strength would see culture bend toward the worship of power. Songs, stories, and rituals would glorify invincibility, turning strength into the highest virtue. Art would depict him as eternal, a living monument, while technology might stagnate, slowed by reliance on his might rather than invention. Why build machines when one man can topple walls? Progress would be measured not in tools, but in the shadow of a hero, and culture itself would orbit around the myth of unbroken power. Images collide in a sweeping montage. Samson striding across battlefields, his shadow stretching over trembling armies, the roar of collapsing walls as his hands tear stone apart, villages erupting in celebration, torches blazing against the night sky, Philistine warriors scattering like dust before a storm. The camera lingers on faces, awe, fear, devotion, each expression a testament to the weight of his unbroken strength. The rhythm quickens, banners snapping in the wind, temples trembling, children gazing upward as if watching a living myth. The montage crescendos, a visual symphony of power, faith, and destiny, leaving the audience breathless at the scale of a world reshaped by one man. Samson's unbroken strength reveals a paradox. Power without weakness may inspire awe, but it denies the lessons born from struggle. Humanity learns through limits, through the cracks where humility enters. Without them, strength risks becoming tyranny, and greatness loses its soul. The reflection is clear. True destiny is not forged by endless might, but by the balance between power and vulnerability. And so the vision ends, but the question lingers. A world where Samson never lost his strength is a world forever altered, trembling beneath the weight of unbroken power. Yet strength without weakness is a story unfinished, a destiny unresolved. The chain of history bends here, but where does it lead? Stay with me, because in the next chapter, we will explore how one man's endless might could ignite consequences beyond imagination.